So let me then be delighted to welcome Annette, Annette Lancy to the stage. She's our opening speaker and she's the acting CEO at Family Safety Victoria. Prior to joining Family Safety Victoria, when it was established in July 2017, Annette worked across multiple state and federal government departments, as well as in the private and higher education sector. A lawyer, economist, and by training, Annette is particularly passionate about the opportunity for governments to work with partners to drive complex systems reform to improve outcomes for citizens. And I think yesterday we had a very big and important event about the family violence agenda, research agenda for Victoria, which her department and the Centre for Excellence and the other peaks and the universities all came together yesterday. It was a wonderful event, and I think testimony to this notion of working together to bring complex systems together and to collaborate. So welcome, Annette.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for that very kind introduction. It's always worrying to be introduced to a practice forum as a lawyer and an economist, but we'll see how we go. I am very pleased to be here. Before I start, I do want to also thank Perry for his welcome to country and acknowledge any Aboriginal elders that we have in the room today. Family Safety Victoria has been so pleased to work with the Centre for Excellence on preparing today. It really provides an opportunity to understand what we know, to build and share the evidence we have, including your own practice wisdom, and it's this collective evidence that will help us respond better to young people using violence in the home and their families. I think as a society, we coo over the first time we meet a newborn baby, but otherwise it's very rare, if at all, that our systems, our services really orientate themselves towards the rights and needs of children and young people. And really our family violence response system is no exception. The Royal Commission told us very strongly that we needed to increase the visibility of children and young people as people in their own right and respond to their individual needs as victims of violence directly, or indeed recognising the legal definition of family violence in Victoria, that exposing children to family violence or its impacts is in itself a form of family violence, and of course we know a critical driver of cumulative harm for children and young people and their well-being. We use the phrase adolescents using violence in the home to refer to young people who use violence against their parents or carers, usually their mothers, or siblings and family members. We do this because, to point to Kathy's introductory remarks, it forces us to acknowledge that by definition, these are children, young people, and we need as a service system to ensure we label people with terms that we, not as a perpetrator or other terms we may use for adults. I also want to acknowledge that we are starting to see a significant increase in adolescents using violence in the context of their own emerging intimate partner relationships. And obviously, although the context and dynamics of this type of violence is different, both can have devastating effects and require a holistic and therapeutic response right through our service systems. Now, am I going to have to press the button? So I thought I would speak for a few minutes about the foundational work and the reform drivers within government and then some of the key statistics and where we are trying to drive the reform across the system. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there are a complex and interrelated suite of government reform underway, but the foundation of all of them is to enable us to build better outcomes for children, young people and their families, and a service system that works for them. The key themes across all of the reforms are consistent. Person-centred approaches, the use of evidence to inform programs and services, an increasing focus on outcomes for clients rather than strict eligibility criteria, pushing people into one program or response or another, and critically intervening earlier to prevent or reduce the need for statutory and justice interventions. And to underpin all of this, a critical importance on sharing information, understanding different and common elements of practice, and joining up service response. We are working across government really hard to make sure that these various strands of reforms are joined up and make it as easy as possible for practitioners on the ground like yourselves to be able to receive the changes, understand how they work together, and not have to kind of get lots of different things from government with different coloured branding on the top and left working out how they fit together. And as part of that, those of you who are very eager would have noticed I was due to present this morning with my colleague, Aguirre Alessandratos, who is the Deputy Secretary of Children and Families area in the Department of Health and Human Services. He unfortunately is an apology for today, but I think testament to how much work he and I do together that he's confident that I can speak on his reform as well as the work that we're doing in Family Safety Victoria. So on the Royal Commission, as you know, the Royal Commission made 227 recommendations to improve services for victim survivors of family violence and to pivot our system to hold perpetrators of violence to account. In relation to adolescents using violence in the home, the Commission highlighted the devastating effects of adolescent family violence on young people and their families, the lack of community awareness that has led to significant underreporting of this type of family violence, probably less than even the level of underreporting we know we have for all forms of family violence, and the stigma and shame associated with adolescent family violence that has created significant barriers to victim survivors seeking help until points of absolute crisis. The Royal Commission also told us that we need to apply a different lens. As I said before, a different response to adult family violence, which consider the adolescent's age, safety and developmental needs, and the likelihood that the young person themselves is a victim survivor of family violence. As we build and nuance our response to adolescent family violence, we're also, as I said, linking to the broader reform work across government. Our child and family system transformation under the Roadmap for Reform, and the work that's been recently announced, which is underway between the Departments of Health and Human Services and Justice and Community Safety and the sector to improve services and outcomes for people who use multiple services across justice, health and community services. This is known as the Common Clients Project, particularly focusing on how we join up government-delivered services at critical points in people's journey into or through and exiting the justice system. As I said, all of these reforms are aimed to break down the system barriers, build on what works, and develop new ways of working that are designed around the person rather than the process or the way that government chooses to organise itself. We know that in the case of adolescent family violence, there'll be no one-size-fits-all, and we need to be developing more nuanced and personalised approaches based on what our clients tell us, what the evidence tells us about the right mix, sequence and intensity of service and practice approaches. And to assist with that, we've been doing a power of work within government, also linking the data that we have at the moment about service usage and looking at that to understand people's journeys through the systems, what are the bundles of services that people typically access in what order, and how might we make that a more streamlined and useful process, stop people bouncing around from previous services. So I wanted to touch for a moment about what we know about adolescent family violence. And I thought, given that, we'd start with the data, because even just a few data points, I think help us really understand and really bring home the problem that we are dealing with. It shows that adolescent family violence is not uncommon, and currently the outcomes for young people and their families is quite poor. The recent Crime Statistics Agency data snapshot showed that while around 1 in 10 police call-outs for family violence in between July 2018 and the end of June 2019 were for adolescent respondents, the prevalence is increasing. There's been an 11.8% increase over the past 5 years. Most adolescent family violence incidents where police attend involve parents, 60%, but intimate partner violence is the fastest growing type of adolescent family violence police are responding to, growing over 20% in the last 5 years. We know that the rates of adolescent family violence are twice as high in regional and rural Victoria compared to our major cities, and that incidents outside the major cities were more likely to include drug and alcohol use and mental health issues for all parties involved in the incident. We know from the CSA data also that over half the adolescents using family violence have prior contact with police as a victim survivor of family violence, or with courts as a protected person on a family violence intervention order. And I think critically, the CSA data is able to look forward as well and tells us that 80% of adolescent respondents also had future contact with the justice system following their first adolescent family violence incident where police attended, and more than half were recorded in future family violence incidents. We know that adolescent family violence is gendered, but not as marked as adult family violence. Victims are often single mothers or younger female siblings, and male adolescents are the most likely to use violence against family members. We know when we look at our linked data also that a significant number of young people in out-of-home care have experienced family violence, and a number of those young people have used family violence in the home. And you'll have an opportunity later this morning to hear from Elena Campbell, the primary author of the PIPA report that was recently released. And that also is adding to our understanding of the evidence base of adolescent family violence, in particular the prevalence of adolescents using violence who had a psychosocial or cognitive disability. In their work, they reviewed case files and found that in just under 50% of the files they reviewed, the young person had a psychosocial or cognitive disability. And I think Elena will probably talk more about the questions that raises about the suitability of a correctional or court-based response in those circumstances. So obviously really what we need to focus on government is what we need to do to change those poor outcomes. I've mentioned not a homogenous group, various characteristics. We obviously need a nuanced approach, but we also critically, I think, to respond to that diversity of experience, diversity of drivers, need a response that puts the young person and their family at the centre. It needs to be developmentally and trauma-informed, but also with a clear understanding of violence, safety and risk. It needs to work across service systems and allow workforces to collaborate to bring their specialist skills and knowledge and work as a team around the young person and the family. It needs to be flexible and work across a family context to understand that families themselves represent a diversity of makeups in modern Victorian community. We obviously need to continue to prioritise Aboriginal-led and designed responses for young people, families and their communities, and increase our understanding of adolescent family violence and its dynamics in other diverse communities within Victoria. In doing all of this, we obviously also need to ensure that we are considering not only the rights of the young people using family violence and their developmental needs, their right to receive early, responsive and effective support to heal, but how do we balance and also achieve the rights of all family members, including other children that may be present in the home, to be in a safe environment. So what are we doing to live up to that challenge? FSV has been working in the few years since it's been established to build some of the building blocks that will help us respond to that. We have provided some additional adolescent family violence service delivery to young people and their families, particularly in Barwon and Bayside Peninsula, where we've used the Orange Door to provide priority referral pathways. But critically, most of our work to date has focused on some of the other enabling elements, embedding practice guidance for adolescent family violence into the new MARAM, the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment and Management Framework for Family Violence. This supports broader workforce to intervene earlier in the lives of these adolescents and their families through effective family violence risk assessment and management. And going forward, we are building on developing further practice guidance for universal services who will often work with adolescents, not necessarily coming to them because of violence, but has an opportunity to engage with them, to identify risk factors and support them to engage with relevant services. We are working up in the Mallee with the local Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisation to design and deliver to pilot an Aboriginal specific service for adolescents who use violence in the home and the community. And we are working with our colleagues in Justice and Community Safety to consider how to develop and test and embed restorative practice approaches where that's an appropriate response. And I think critically, and goes to the point of joining up the various systems, we have in the last year rolled out statewide a therapeutic program for victim survivors of family violence, which has had a targeted focus on making sure that children and young people also have service that speak to their needs as part of that. Focus on building and repairing parent-child relationships that may have been damaged, as well as safety and risk work. And in the department, in the roadmap to reform, similarly, the effort going forward over the next year will be on focusing on 4 key groups of children and families that have needs not adequately met, frequent service usage, higher rates of entry into care, and who often experience higher levels of intergenerational disadvantage and contact with child protection. The first priority will be to safely reduce the rate of growth in care, especially for Aboriginal children and young people, through intensive family preservation and restoration. And we know that the cohorts that the department is keen to focus on in that work, while not completely aligned with, will have a significant overlap with cohorts, families where family violence or adolescent family violence is present. Includes vulnerable children and families pre-birth and in the first 3 years of life, children and young people experiencing cumulative harm, of which family violence in the home is a significant factor. And as I said, children and young people who are already identified as high risk of entering care or already in residential care. So to conclude, that is, I think we've had a significant focus on this work across government, but we're really clear in government that there is more work to be done. A lot of work has happened over the last little while about building the evidence base. I'm so pleased that so many of our colleagues from academia, from various service organisations who have been piloting, trialling and gathering the evidence of how you translate promising and emerging evidence into practice will be here today to share their expertise and their thoughts. I think collectively is the only way that we will make real progress and be able to bring that to scale and address this challenge. So thank you once again for making time to be here today. I hope you really enjoy the day, get a lot of really useful information that you can take back and use in your own practice. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
So thank you very much, Annette. Just a very lovely opening to the day ahead, and putting this data up, I think, just situates us very well to understand some of the issues that we're facing. But we're ahead of time. So if there are any questions for Annette, then do ask them now. Because I think, the role of government in this space is absolutely critical, and just thinking through how that plays through. I think we've had some very good leadership in government that kind of gets it, which is great. I don't feel as though we're pushing against government to go, you don't get it, you really... My sense is, in fact, that it is, we're pushing on an open door here, and we're all speaking from the same song, singing from the same song sheet. But are there some particular issues that you would like Annette to address or think about or take back to the powers that be? Yes, in the back.
So probably not something that I'd feel confident speaking as an expert on. I think, though, what I would say is right across the work that we do, and this work we're doing in adolescent family violence is no exception. We've always focused on the need to work and be led by Aboriginal community about what they think the drivers are in their community and what they think the solutions are. So that's why we are working with the ACO to design and test a program there. It's also why more broadly at Family Safety Victoria we work through what we call the DELCJAR Partnership Forum, which is our 10-year agreement between government and Aboriginal community for family violence prevention and response. And the work that we will do in terms of adolescent family violence program for Aboriginal community will also go through that forum. That's the way that we make sure that not only do we get services that are Aboriginally led and the design, but also we get a sense of how much do different Aboriginal communities in different places around the state want to adapt and change programs to meet their particular community concerns or drivers. So I'd say that rather than giving you an expert view, which I don't have, on how it changes from Aboriginal community to Aboriginal community.
Hi, can you hear me? Yep. Hi, I'm Casey from Uniting, and I manage Child, Youth and Family Services for GNE, so a big chunk of regional Victoria. And I'm really keen to see better design and modelling for regional areas. I think the work you guys do is excellent, but quite often when it's brought up to our area due to funding, outreach requirements, it's often not working as well as it should. And my team deals with a lot of adolescent violence through outreach, and we're very lucky to have the next person who's about to ask a question, Brendan, do some training for our team in that space. But how are you actually going to pilot and test models in regional Victoria and make sure they're appropriately adapted for our communities?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think that's a really good point. What I'd say, a couple of things. So the current funded programs from Family Safety Victoria in terms of adolescent family violence operate both, there's a few in Metro Melbourne, the others are in what I would call regional cities, so Ballarat and Geelong. I think we're really conscious that again, in regional communities, the particular barriers that people face to service access are different, and that's obviously something, if we are able to move and fund more projects and more programs statewide, we would utilise a commissioning process to get a sense of how do we make sure it can be adapted. I think the other thing, to go back to one of the first points I made, is that what part of, I think, the work to be done on developing the evidence base is also about how do we make sure that government is really clear and then there is some level of accountability to service providers about the types of outcomes, the types of activity that we know is most likely to be successful and a successful intervention, but the government's not overly prescriptive on things that might make sense in an aggregate level, but then practitioners or service providers either do not have, or I think critically feel they do not have sufficient flexibility to mould that service to the needs of a particular young person and their family. So that'll be, I think, another really critical bit of the design process. How do we make sure that the service specifications give as much flexibility as possible if people have models that they know will work in a particular context, whether that's what it looks like when you have to do more outreach in a rural and regional area, whether it's if you're working with a particular ethno-specific community, whatever might be the particulars of the circumstance, trying to give service providers as much flexibility as possible to be able to utilise the resources that they are given in the most effective way. So I'll make a couple of comments. I think one of the things that's really exciting for Family Safety Victoria out of today is that I think right throughout the day we'll have staff around during the day who will hear the feedback that you have about this is all great, but this enabler needs more, this, that. Workforce, I think, is a challenge across the family violence reform agenda at a whole range of levels. Overall amount of workforce, giving people time to come off frontline work, to participate and have some professional development about some of the elements of new practice that we already have, as well as the point you're making, which is about people who need to build quite specialised and stronger capabilities. really open to receiving ideas about how we do that, how services who have developed models and tested models of service, how they might use something like the open network that the Centre for Excellence operates to share back to the sector what were the critical enablers and what kind of workforce capabilities are necessary to deliver a particular program. That's another really important part that I think the sector can play a really great work at sharing with each other and sharing back to government. So I don't have the full answer for that. I think it's absolutely an issue, but those are the kind of things I think this discussion really needs to start and build on as we continue to grow the evidence base and think about how we best move this work forward.